Welcome back. Now, several thousand people marched through Dublin City yesterday, again, to highlight the homelessness crisis and the housing crisis. Now, it was organised by Raise the Roof, the campaign which wants the government to declare a national emergency.
Joining us to discuss this and the other stories making today's Sunday papers are Shane Beattie of News Talk and Michelle Hennessy, senior reporter with the Journal.ie. Good morning to you both. Let's start with that Raising the Roof housing march that happened yesterday, guys. The Sunday Independent have revealed 1.2 billion bill to buy social housing. Ultimately, Michelle, this is about the government buying up housing. They're competing with first-time buyers rather than actually building the housing that would be much cheaper.
Yeah, that's right. And these are actually figures compiled by Fianna Fáil. They got a rake of data through a Freedom of Information request. And according to this, the average price for a social housing unit was 158,200 nationally, and in Dublin it was 223,951. And the cost of building a new home in Dublin during that same period would have been 199,000. Now, these are figures from the Department of Housing, so the government's own figures are saying this. And what the story today is saying is that there are obviously a lot of first-time buyers trying to get into the market. And if the government isn't building its own social housing, it's basically just swooping in and taking the opportunity away from them. And I was saying to Shane before we come on as well, I'm a renter, and I see that as making the situation worse for us in some ways as well, because if there are fewer rental properties, rent is going to stay sky high like it is now, and there are going to be fewer properties for landlords to invest in as well, to rent out.
It's also driving up the price of the actual property because you've got competition now between first-time buyers and the government. Is that right, Shane?
Yeah. I mean, there's a question that has to be asked here. A lot of people are asking the question, is this government opposed to building houses? Now, they say absolutely not. Fine Gael says they aren't ideologically opposed to building houses. But when you look at a lot of the evidence, I mean, last year, according to the Sunday Independent, 836 or 38 homes were built through social housing. So the policy has been to buy up social housing rather than build them. And that is the question that has to be asked. Why isn't the state building the volume of houses that needs to be built, the type of houses that were built in the 70s and 80s that a lot of people tuning in this morning are living in, very well-built houses, and it just isn't happening for some reason. The other thing as well, I mean, we're talking about pitting people against each other, so the government versus a first-time buyer trying to buy a house. There is also the situation that people are really saving to try and buy a house, maybe they're having to move back home for a couple of years to get the deposit for a house. How fair is it that when a house comes on the market, they are against the government trying to buy it, or else they're buying a house and then they see next door the house was just bought up by the government? So everybody's against everybody. A lot of people would feel that the property market just isn't working in this country, and more people are going to be on the streets protesting.
And one of the main threads run through the protest yesterday was obviously the homelessness crisis. The figures are currently 10,000 adults and children in temporary emergency accommodation around. Like, it should be declared a national emergency, shouldn't it?
Well, Peter McVerry is saying we're going from crisis to catastrophe. So it's no longer going to be classed as a housing crisis anymore. It's going to be a catastrophe. But that figure of 10,000, for some reason now, that's a sort of, not an acceptable figure, but it's sort of the accepted figure that we all just throw out there.
Have we become a little immune to the crisis?
Yeah, it seems I mean, Peter McVerry is saying that when the banks start kicking people out of their homes, when the investors start kicking people out of their homes, we're going to see even more people protesting on the streets. Not since the water charges protest have we seen such big crowds out protesting. So, look, there's an election in a few days' time.
But there is no, the government's answer will be there's no simple solve to it. And there's probably 10, 15, 20 different strands of things that have to change to ultimately address the problem.
They've also been in power since 2011, and
so where do they start?
I mean, the thing is that one of the big criticisms of this Rebuilding Ireland plan for addressing the homeless and housing crisis, one of the major criticisms is that there's too much of a reliance on the private sector for this. So whether we're talking about renting or whether we're talking about building houses and the government buying them off the private developers, that probably is where they need to look at changes, because it's obviously not working doing it that way.
And 40,000 mortgages in arrears. Peter McVerry also spoke about that. That's just it's incredibly sad when you look at the human stories behind that number.
It's huge. And I mean, the government talks an awful lot about, there aren't huge numbers of repossessions and evictions in this country. But the central bank itself has said that of the 40,000 mortgages in arrears of more than 2 years, that at least 17,000 1,000 of those are going to be repossessed. Now, if those homes are repossessed, you have families going into homelessness.
Yeah.
And you also have, it's obviously not a huge number, but there are numbers every year of people who are voluntarily surrendering their homes as well. So those aren't in repossession figures. Those are people who they see the pressure as too much and they don't see that there's another option. And sometimes there's an awful lot of pressure from the bank and saying, it might just be easier if you gave up the house. And a lot of people do that,
Yeah.
Moving on, Shane, you might talk us through the latest developments, particularly in terms of the Sunday Indos headline, which is how the trap was laid for suspect guards. So the story that the 3 guards who were arrested and subsequently released without charge. Where are we at now with this?
Well, I have to say it's fascinating reading. Maeve Sheehan has got an awful lot of information about how it's led to the arrests this week. It's really interesting reading. I don't know if many people are watching Line of Duty, but this really is straight out of what Line of Duty and AC12
the
would do.
storyline.
It's just it would be a storyline out of Line of Duty. So Maeve Sheehan, I mean, I don't want to spoil the story too much for people because I'd like people to actually read it because it's really interesting reading. But the story essentially is how an elite Garda unit went about these arrests this week, and it goes way back to, I think it was November actually, when they were involved in listening to phone calls of one of the Gardaí and a criminal, and they got a tip off of what they heard was something that was said about possibly the gang being tipped off about a raid that was coming up. And then Maeve Sheehan goes through the whole details of it and how this elite unit was putting out misinformation and seeing where that information ended up and seeing what information got to the gang and then who they gave that information to that got to the gang.
How the information was channeled down to the gang.
So it is fascinating. We should remind people that the 3 Gardaí have only been arrested. They have been released without charge. A file is being prepared for the DPP.
Yeah.
They are suspended from duty as we speak, but it is absolutely fascinating.
A dedicated anti-corruption unit will be set up before the end of the year. Why do we not have an anti-corruption unit already?
Well,
Do you not think that most people will realise
I would
that
have thought we
today
had,
and assume that we had one?
Yeah, I think that there probably was a perception here that corruption wasn't something that was wide scale in the Guards, and I'm not sure if people even thought that it was necessarily happening, that this kind of stuff was happening, because it is, very much...
So is that a case of that's only a little bit of corruption? We don't need a unit to investigate
that possibly was it, but you also have to remember that during the recession, they weren't spending any money on general policing anyway. The money just wasn't there. So
this was a luxury.
So things like this would have been seen as a luxury. But we heard just in recent weeks, actually the week before these arrests, we heard from the Garda Commissioner, Drew Harris, that there are plans now to set up this anti-corruption unit and that it's going to be in place by the end of the year. I mean, I think a lot of people will probably understand that this is, just sort of a small number of bad eggs in the force. Yeah. And, usually public confidence is quite high in the Guards. They do this public attitude survey every quarter. And it's usually around 89% of people have a mid to high level of trust in the Guards. And I think that's the kind of day-to-day one-on-one interactions that they have with the Guard on the beat. But what Drew Harris was saying is that if it's there, they need to be weeding it out because that can do huge damage to public confidence, in the police force.
And it's corrosive, that also spreads.
But even the Garda Press Office putting out a statement mentioning corruption in public office, it's unheard of for the Gardaí, talking about other Gardaí and allegations of corruption. I mean, there's a lot of problems in the Gardaí, as we know, and you can go back in recent years, but I do think that what's happening at the moment is a breath of fresh air for the Gardaí.
We've run out of time. We can't talk about Trump.
About Trump. You're down to shame.
Allegedly.
Shame, allegedly.
Shane Beattie and Michelle Hennessy, thank you very much for
Thanks,
joining us. Now, up next, how to save some money on the monster that is your mortgage. Stay with us.